Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Matt, and today I want to talk about a really critical language learning lesson that's maybe a little bit different than what you're used to. And it's really talking about maximizing the value that you get out of the time that you invest in language learning. And this is really important. And I think this is just kind of really seen by the kind of formula that I have above, which is time times quality equals value. Now, time is kind of the minutes or the hours that we're doing something. And in our case, that would be language learning, right? Learning a language. And quality would be the effectiveness of our learning, which is influenced by a lot of different factors. So think things like your language learning method, your current energy level, how much motivation you have, difficulty of the content that you're using, what you're learning about, or other external life factors. And really, there's a number of examples that you could put here. And that ultimately leads to value. And in the end of the day, when we're kind of learning a language, we are trying to maximize value. Now, I do want to kind of preface that you don't have to think about language learning from a pure optimization perspective, right? Like, not everything in your life has to be optimized around language learning. Your process doesn't have to be maximized, but it's worth thinking about this concept in order to just get the most value out of the time that you invest with language learning. And ultimately, when we think about value, right, it's the knowledge of the language, right? Things like words known, our speaking skills in the language, how good we are at listening, and things like that. And it's really important to just kind of understand that just because you learn a language for more time and a longer time doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get more value. And actually, surprisingly, you actually might get less value by more time invested with the language. So, for just a kind of a quick example, think about studying for 30 minutes where you're really dedicated, you're really motivated, you're very focused, versus spending an hour learning a language, but you're very distracted, you're not feeling very well. Well, just because you invested that hour of time, it's kind of deceptive because maybe you didn't learn the language as well compared to being really focused in for that 30 minutes of time. So it's a very important thing to just kind of think about when we're trying to maximize our language learning overall. And it's really important just to ask yourselves a couple of questions sometimes. So think once again back to the formula that I talked about, time times quality equals value. And maybe some of the questions you might ask yourself is it better for me to study in shorter time frames, right? It might even make a lot of sense to just break out your studying into like 15-minute increments versus kind of hour-long sessions, or maybe the other way around. Like I said, it doesn't really matter the time investment per se. What we're trying to do is get better at the language. And so if it makes more sense to do it in shorter time bursts, then do that, or longer time bursts. Another question that you might ask yourself is the language learning method that I'm using fun or effective? This is very important, right? If we're using something that's not effective or not very fun, our quality deteriorates. And ultimately, we need to try to find the best methods, the best ways to learn a language such that we get more competent in the language quicker or more efficiently. Am I concentrating on the areas that will give me the most value right now? For a lot of beginners, it's really all about learning a lot of words. And maybe it also is something like you need to improve your listening, or maybe at a certain point it's speaking. It's always important to kind of identify those areas because sometimes concentrating on those particular things that you really need to work on is ultimately going to get you more value and more competency in the end of the day. Am I consistent with my language learning? A lot of people struggle with this. A lot of people struggle with being consistent, studying the language every single day or every week. And just doing that, where you have a constant kind of time investment into language learning, can be a huge difference maker in terms of just kind of getting more out of your language learning just because you have that consistency kind of, dedicated, every week, every month, etc. Do I have goals? What am I aiming for? I think this is very important as well. What is your target? What is your end goal for language learning? And when you have that kind of defined for yourself, you're able to set up benchmarks and kind of things that you need to do on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And that can be very, very, important overall to getting to the competency level you want in a certain amount of time. So, if you don't have goals, consider setting goals. Should you create weekly targets to give yourself more motivation and consistent results? Sometimes having weekly targets, whether it's the amount of words that you're going to learn every single week, the amount of hours that you're going to study, can be huge in terms of just having a consistent amount of time in the language learning process, but also just kind of guaranteeing that you're getting consistent results, every week, every month, etc. Are you too focused on completing certain material or finishing an app versus using a better method? Some people really want to finish kind of all the levels in Duolingo, for example, or maybe finish all of the Rosetta Stone level 1 or level 2, or they want to keep finishing this Netflix series. Maybe it makes a lot of sense not to just focus in on that completion factor, that sense that we'll feel more accomplished, but really focus on the things that are ultimately going to get us better at the language, right? Maybe it's we're trying to maximize things that aren't really ultimately helping us to get more value, right, or more competency in language learning. And then other external factors are like, are you getting enough sleep, or are you learning when you're hungry? Maybe the time of day that you're studying, you're just very distracted, you're not motivated, you're not into it. And that can be just as important as the method that you're using, or whether or not you have goals. And of course, these are just some of the questions that you might ask yourself. I think it's really just important to think about this idea in terms of what's going to get you the most value for your time. And it's just we don't want to optimize arbitrary things in language learning, right? Like the amount of time that we study, is important, right? There's these benchmarks of the FSI of how many hours it might take us to get fluent, but ultimately we're not trying to maximize the amount of hours that we spend learning a language. We're not trying to maximize a language learning streak or some statistic on an app. We're trying to get better at the language, and we want to do whatever kind of mixture is going to get us to that point, right? And obviously we have to invest some sort of time in the language, right? We can have the best method, we can have the most optimized sleep schedule ever, but if we only invest, 2 minutes a week into language learning, we're not going to get very far. So you have to have that time investment, but for that time, we want to make sure that, hey, what's the quality that we're also kind of putting into that time? And this stuff really does add up in the end of the day. So if you just think about a graph like this, right? At the very beginning, there is kind of not this huge difference between just kind of an optimized way and a better way. But over time, over the long term, that gap starts to widen, and you're getting even more results over time. You're learning more and more words. You're putting more time into the language. You're getting better at speaking. You're getting better at listening. And over the long term, that really adds up, where if you take that optimized approach and compare it to a more standard way, the difference is massive. And so, that can be the huge difference between being at a B2 level versus being at a B1 level, or even at an A2 level. It can be the difference between enjoying compelling content and still being kind of stuck in this beginner phase. So, don't underestimate these optimizations that you can do to maximize, your progress in language learning, because while it might not seem a lot over the course of a day or the course of a week, over the long term, it really adds up. And kind of once you have that huge gap, there's just, if you're comparing yourself to another language learning that's using that standard approach, after a while, that gap is so huge that it doesn't matter if they spend 18 hours, learning the language. You have such a huge gap that they'll never catch up to you. But you don't want to compare yourself, but it's just to kind of give you that magnitude of over the long term, what an optimized approach can do for you in the end of the day. So that's what I had to say. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.